The winter of 1868 settled over Millbrook, Wisconsin, like a suffocating shroud, its icy fingers reaching into every corner of the small farming community. Snow blanketed the rolling hills and dense forests that surrounded the town, creating an isolation that seemed to press down upon the souls of its inhabitants. In this remote corner of America, where the nearest railroad station lay 40 miles to the south, the Moorfield family had established themselves as pillars of moral rectitude and Christian devotion. Ezekiel Moorfield stood at the pulpit of the modest wooden church every Sunday morning, his weathered hands gripping the worn Bible as his deep voice resonated through the small sanctuary. At 53, he possessed the commanding presence of a man who had never questioned his place in God's divine order. His steel-gray eyes swept across the congregation with an intensity that made even the most faithful parishioners shift uncomfortably in their pews. Behind him sat his family. His wife Martha, a woman of 45, whose once beautiful features had been carved into sharp angles by years of prairie wind, and something darker that lurked behind her pale blue eyes. Their eldest son, Jeremiah, 28, whose broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of hard labor, but whose gaze held an unsettling hunger. Their daughter Constance, 25, whose modest dress and downcast eyes masked secrets that would have horrified the townspeople, and the youngest, Samuel, barely 21, whose nervous fidgeting during services was attributed to youthful restlessness, rather than the terrible knowledge he carried. The Moorfield farm sprawled across 300 acres of prime Wisconsin land, its red barn and white farmhouse standing as testaments to prosperity in a region where many struggled to survive. Ezekiel had inherited the property from his father, who had claimed it from the wilderness 30 years prior. The family's wealth came not only from their successful crops and livestock, but also from Ezekiel's position as the town's unofficial spiritual leader, and his wife Martha's skill as a midwife and healer. People traveled from neighboring settlements to seek their guidance, both spiritual and practical. But as the bitter February wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees that lined the property, the true nature of the Moorfield family's devotion was about to be tested by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Thomas Whitmore had been traveling for 3 days through the treacherous winter landscape, his horse struggling through snowdrifts that reached nearly to its belly. The young man of 26 had been making his way from Milwaukee to Minnesota, carrying important documents for a lumber company, when the latest blizzard had forced him to seek shelter. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, he spotted the warm glow of lanterns emanating from the Moorfield farmhouse windows. Ezekiel answered the door himself, his imposing frame filling the doorway as he studied the frost-covered stranger. "Good evening, traveler," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man accustomed to authority. "The Lord has brought you to our door on this harsh night." Thomas removed his hat, snow cascading from its brim onto the wooden porch. "I apologize for the intrusion, sir. I'm Thomas Whitmore, and I'm afraid I'm quite lost. My horse can go no further in this storm." "Nonsense," Ezekiel replied, stepping aside to allow the young man entry. "Christian hospitality demands that we offer shelter to those in need. Come, warm yourself by our fire." The interior of the Moorfield home was a study in contradictions. The main living area was spartanly furnished, with simple wooden furniture and religious texts prominently displayed on every available surface. Crucifixes adorned the walls alongside hand-stitched samplers bearing biblical verses. Yet there was an underlying opulence that seemed at odds with the family's public displays of humility. Rich fabrics draped over chairs, expensive china displayed in a corner cabinet, and an ornate grandfather clock that must have cost more than most families in Millbrook earned in a year. Martha emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron as she studied their unexpected guest. "You must be frozen to the bone," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll prepare a hot meal and ready the guest room. As Thomas gratefully accepted their hospitality, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The family members exchanged glances that seemed to carry hidden meanings, and there was an undercurrent of tension that permeated the seemingly peaceful household. Jeremiah watched him with an intensity that made Thomas uncomfortable, while Constance barely looked up from her needlework. Samuel appeared nervous, jumping at every sound and avoiding eye contact entirely. During dinner, Ezekiel dominated the conversation, speaking at length about the importance of moral purity and the dangers of succumbing to worldly temptations. "The flesh is weak," he intoned, his eyes fixed on Thomas with an unsettling intensity. "Only through absolute submission to God's will can we hope to overcome our base nature." Martha nodded in agreement, her pale hands folded primly in her lap. "We have dedicated our lives to serving the Lord in all things," she added. "Every aspect of our existence must be an offering to His glory." As the evening progressed, Thomas noticed other peculiarities. The house was unusually warm despite the bitter cold outside, and he could hear strange sounds coming from somewhere below, rhythmic thumping and what sounded like muffled voices. When he inquired about the noise, Ezekiel explained that they were conducting evening prayers in the cellar, where the family gathered for their most sacred devotions. "We believe in the importance of private worship," Ezekiel said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Some aspects of our faith are too sacred to be shared with the outside world." That night, as Thomas lay in the guest room, he found sleep elusive. The sounds from below continued well into the early morning hours, accompanied by what he could have sworn were cries of both anguish and ecstasy. The wind outside seemed to carry whispers, and more than once he thought he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his door. When morning came, Thomas was eager to continue his journey, but Ezekiel insisted that the roads were still impassable. "The Lord has brought you here for a reason," the patriarch said, his hand resting heavily on Thomas's shoulder. "Perhaps it is time for you to experience true devotion." As the day wore on, Thomas began to notice more disturbing details about his hosts. There were locks on doors that seemed to serve no practical purpose, and certain areas of the house were strictly off-limits. The family members moved with a choreographed precision that suggested long-established routines, and their conversations were filled with double meanings and coded references that made Thomas increasingly uneasy. The breaking point came that evening when Constance approached him as he sat reading by the fire. Her usual modest demeanor had been replaced by something predatory, and her eyes held a hunger that made his skin crawl. "Father believes you might be ready to join our evening devotions," she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. "We have such wonderful ways of worshipping the Lord." Thomas's blood ran cold as he realized that his initial instincts had been correct. Whatever the Moorfield family was hiding, it was far more sinister than mere religious eccentricity. As night fell once again, he knew he had to find a way to escape before he became another victim of whatever dark practices took place in the cellar below. But the Moorfield family had no intention of letting their guest leave. They had invested too much time and effort in cultivating their reputation as devout Christians to allow an outsider to threaten their carefully constructed facade. As Thomas would soon discover, the family's definition of Christian devotion bore no resemblance to anything found in the Bible, and their evening rituals were designed to satisfy appetites that had nothing to do with spiritual salvation. The second night at the Moorfield farm brought with it a sense of mounting dread that Thomas could no longer ignore. As darkness settled over the snow-covered landscape, the family's behavior became increasingly erratic and unsettling. During dinner, Ezekiel spoke in riddles about sacred unions and divine submission, while Martha's eyes gleamed with an unholy fervor that made Thomas's stomach turn. "Brother Thomas," Ezekiel said, using a familiarity that the young man had never granted him, "tonight you will witness the true glory of our Lord's work. We have been blessed with revelations that go far beyond the simple teachings of ordinary churches." Samuel, who had been silent throughout the meal, suddenly spoke up with a trembling voice. "Father, perhaps we should wait." "Silence!" Ezekiel's voice cracked like a whip across the dining room. "You will not question the Lord's will, boy. We have discussed this." Thomas noticed how Samuel immediately cowered, his face pale with what appeared to be genuine terror. Constance reached across the table and placed her hand over her younger brother's, but her touch seemed to cause him to flinch rather than provide comfort. After dinner, as Thomas attempted to retire to his room, he found his path blocked by Jeremiah, whose massive frame filled the narrow hallway. The eldest son's eyes held a predatory gleam that made Thomas's skin crawl. "Father wants to see you in the cellar," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying an undertone of barely contained excitement. "It's time for evening prayers." "I appreciate the invitation," Thomas replied carefully, "but I'm quite tired from my journey. Perhaps tomorrow." "It wasn't a request," Jeremiah interrupted, his hand moving to rest on Thomas's shoulder with enough pressure to make his intentions clear. "The family prays together, always." Left with little choice, Thomas allowed himself to be guided toward a door he had noticed, but assumed led to a storage area. As Jeremiah produced a heavy iron key and unlocked the door, the sounds that had been muffled throughout his stay suddenly became clearer. What he heard made his blood run cold. A mixture of chanting, sobbing, and sounds that spoke of activities no Christian household should ever harbor. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under their weight as they descended into the cellar. The air grew thick and oppressive, heavy with the scent of burning candles, unwashed bodies, and something else, something organic and disturbing that Thomas couldn't identify. The temperature, which should have been cooler underground, was stifling, as if the very walls were radiating heat. What Thomas saw when they reached the bottom of the stairs would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. The cellar had been transformed into a grotesque parody of a church sanctuary. Crude wooden pews faced a makeshift altar, but instead of a cross, the focal point was a twisted amalgamation of religious and pagan symbols that hurt to look at directly. Candles flickered from every available surface, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. But it was the congregation that truly horrified him. Nearly 24 people filled the space, men, women, and even some who appeared to be barely past childhood. All were dressed in simple white robes that did little to conceal their bodies beneath, and all bore the same glazed expression of fanatic devotion mixed with something far more carnal. Ezekiel stood at the altar, no longer the respectable patriarch Thomas had met at the door. His own white robe was open at the chest, revealing strange scars that formed patterns across his skin. In his hands, he held what appeared to be a leather-bound book, but the symbols on its cover were unlike any alphabet Thomas had ever seen. "Welcome, Brother Thomas," Ezekiel called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Tonight, you will learn the true meaning of submission to the divine will." Martha appeared at Thomas's side, her earlier modest demeanor completely abandoned. Her robe hung open, revealing her body without shame, and her eyes burned with a fervor that bordered on madness. "The Lord has chosen you," she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. "You will be purified through sacred union." Thomas tried to back toward the stairs, but found his way blocked by other members of the congregation. He recognized some faces from town: the blacksmith's wife, the schoolteacher, even the elderly widow who ran the general store. All of them stared at him with the same hungry expression, as if he were a piece of meat being prepared for consumption. "What is this?" Thomas demanded, his voice cracking with fear and revulsion. "This isn't Christian worship. This is madness." Ezekiel's laughter filled the cellar, a sound devoid of any human warmth. "Christianity?" he spat. "The weak teachings of a carpenter's son? We follow older truths, Brother Thomas." Truths that demand sacrifice, submission, and the complete surrender of the flesh to divine will. As if responding to some unseen signal, the congregation began to move. Robes were discarded without ceremony, revealing bodies marked with the same strange scars that adorned Ezekiel's chest. Men and women paired off in combinations that defied every moral law Thomas had been raised to respect, their movements ritualistic, yet unmistakably carnal. "The flesh must be broken before the spirit can be reborn," Martha explained, her hands beginning to work at the buttons of Thomas's shirt, despite his attempts to pull away. "Pain and pleasure, dominance and submission. These are the tools by which we commune with the divine." Thomas watched in horror as Constance approached the altar, where her father waited with implements that belonged in no house of worship. Leather straps, metal devices whose purpose he didn't want to contemplate, and other tools that spoke of practices that went far beyond mere religious devotion. "Please," Samuel's voice cut through the growing chaos, tears streaming down his young face. "He doesn't understand. He's not ready." "Silence," Ezekiel roared, striking his youngest son across the face with enough force to send him sprawling. "You will participate, or you will be punished, like the others who have disappointed us." It was then that Thomas noticed them, the others Samuel had referenced. In the darkest corners of the cellar, barely visible in the flickering candlelight, were shapes that had once been human. Some were chained to the walls, their bodies bearing evidence of prolonged abuse and torture. Others lay motionless on crude pallets, their eyes vacant and staring. These were the ones who had disappointed the Moorfield family, the ones who had failed to embrace their twisted version of divine worship. "You see," Ezekiel continued, his attention returning to Thomas, "we have been blessed with a revelation. The traditional church teaches that the flesh is sinful, that desire must be suppressed. But we have learned that the opposite is true. Only by embracing every aspect of human nature, pain, pleasure, dominance, submission, can we truly commune with the divine." The patriarch gestured to his family, who had taken their positions around the altar. "Each member of our congregation must prove their devotion through complete surrender. They must be willing to give and receive pain, to submit to the will of those chosen to lead them, and to participate in rituals that bind their souls to our sacred purpose." Thomas felt hands grabbing at him from all sides, tearing at his clothes despite his struggles. The congregation had formed a circle around him, their chanting growing louder and more frenzied. He could see that resistance was futile. There were too many of them, and they moved with the coordinated precision of those who had performed these rituals many times before. "The newcomer must be initiated," Martha declared, her voice rising above the chanting. "He must learn that his body belongs not to himself, but to the divine will, as expressed through our sacred family." As Thomas was forced toward the altar, he caught sight of Samuel huddled in a corner, his young face a mask of terror and revulsion. It was clear that the boy had been subjected to these same rituals, that his nervous behavior and fearful demeanor were the result of years of abuse disguised as religious devotion. The last thing Thomas saw before the congregation overwhelmed him was Ezekiel raising a ceremonial blade above the altar, its surface gleaming in the candlelight. The patriarch's eyes burned with fanatic fervor as he began to recite words in a language that predated Christianity by millennia, words that spoke of sacrifice, submission, and the complete surrender of human dignity to forces that should never have been awakened. As the blade descended and Thomas's screams joined the unholy chorus that filled the cellar, he realized that he had stumbled into something far worse than mere religious extremism. The Moorfield family had created their own twisted theology, one that used the language of faith to justify acts of depravity that would have horrified even the most hardened criminal. And somewhere in the darkness above, the winter wind continued to howl across the Wisconsin prairie, carrying with it the echoes of screams that would never be heard by the outside world. 3 days had passed since Thomas Whitmore's screams had last echoed through the cellar of the Moorfield farmhouse. Now, his broken form lay chained in the darkest corner of the underground chamber, his eyes vacant and staring at nothing. The young man who had sought shelter from a winter storm had been systematically destroyed, his spirit crushed through a combination of physical torture and psychological manipulation that the Moorfield family had perfected over decades. Ezekiel stood over his latest victim, studying the results of their initiation with the clinical detachment of a farmer examining livestock. Thomas's body bore the ritual scars that marked him as property of the family's twisted congregation, carved into his flesh with the same ceremonial blade that had been used on dozens of others over the years. "Another soul saved," Ezekiel murmured to his wife, who stood beside him with a satisfied expression. "The Lord's work continues." Martha nodded, her pale eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "He fought harder than most, but they always break eventually. The flesh is weak, just as Scripture teaches." Above them, in the main house, life continued with the same facade of Christian respectability that had protected the family for so long. Constance prepared breakfast in the kitchen, humming hymns as she worked, while Jeremiah tended to the livestock with the same methodical precision he brought to his nocturnal activities. Only Samuel showed any signs of the trauma that permeated their household, his hands shaking as he attempted to read from the family Bible. The youngest Moorfield son had been born into this nightmare, raised from infancy to believe that the horrors he witnessed were normal expressions of religious devotion. But unlike his siblings, Samuel had never fully embraced the family's twisted theology. The screams that echoed through the house at night haunted his dreams, and the sight of broken bodies in the cellar filled him with a revulsion he struggled to hide. "Samuel," his father's voice cut through his troubled thoughts as Ezekiel emerged from the cellar. "We need to discuss your recent behavior." The young man's blood ran cold. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing that his reluctance to participate fully in the family's rituals had not gone unnoticed. "Yes, father?" Ezekiel's steel-gray eyes studied his youngest son with the same intensity he brought to his sermons. "Your mother and I have noticed your hesitation during our evening devotions. This troubles us greatly." "I'm sorry, father. I've been feeling unwell." "Lies," Ezekiel interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "You have been infected with doubt, boy. The same weakness that plagued your grandfather before we corrected his thinking." Samuel's grandfather had died when he was very young, but he remembered the old man's warnings about the family's special prayers. He had always wondered what had happened to silence those warnings permanently. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression cold and calculating. "Perhaps it's time for Samuel to undergo a more intensive purification," she suggested. "The same treatment we gave to Brother Marcus when he began to question our methods." Samuel remembered Brother Marcus, a traveling preacher who had stayed with them the previous summer. The man had arrived full of fire and brimstone, eager to share his evangelical fervor with the family. He had left as a hollow shell, his mind broken by weeks of spiritual guidance that had stripped away every vestige of his former personality. "Please," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible, "I'll do better. I'll participate fully in the rituals." Ezekiel studied his son for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You will indeed. Tonight, you will lead the initiation of our newest prospect." Samuel's heart sank as he realized what his father meant. There was another traveler upstairs, a young woman named Rebecca, who had arrived that morning seeking shelter from the continuing winter storms. She was perhaps 22 years old, with auburn hair and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and life. The thought of what his family planned to do to her made Samuel physically ill. "I don't think I'm ready for such responsibility," he said desperately. "You are 21 years old," Martha replied sharply. "Your brother was leading initiations when he was 17. It's time for you to prove your devotion to the family and to our sacred mission." As if summoned by their conversation, Jeremiah appeared in the kitchen doorway. His massive frame filled the space, and his eyes held the same predatory gleam that Samuel had learned to fear. "The girl is asking about the roads," he reported. "She wants to leave this afternoon." "Inform her that the weather has taken a turn for the worse," Ezekiel instructed. "She'll need to stay at least another night. That will give us time to prepare her properly." Samuel watched his family discuss Rebecca's fate with the same casual efficiency they might use to plan a barn raising. To them, she was simply another resource to be exploited, another soul to be broken and molded to their twisted purposes. The fact that she was young, intelligent, and full of life only made her more valuable in their eyes. "What about the authorities?" Samuel asked, grasping for any excuse to delay the inevitable. "People will come looking for her eventually." Ezekiel's laugh was devoid of warmth. "Who will look for a traveling woman with no family? We've been doing this for 30 years, boy, and no one has ever come asking questions. The world is full of people who disappear without a trace." It was true, Samuel realized with growing horror. Over the years, dozens of travelers had sought shelter at the Moorfield farm. Some had been broken and absorbed into the congregation, while others had simply vanished entirely. The family's reputation for Christian hospitality actually served as the perfect cover for their predatory activities. "Besides," Martha added with a cruel smile, "Sheriff Morrison is one of our most devoted congregation members. He understands the importance of our work." Samuel's last hope crumbled as he remembered the portly sheriff who attended their Sunday services with such apparent devotion. He had always assumed the man was simply another victim of his father's charismatic preaching, but now he realized that Morrison was an active participant in the family's crimes. As the day progressed, Samuel watched helplessly as his family prepared for another night of horror. Constance sharpened the ceremonial blades with loving care, while Jeremiah tested the strength of the chains and restraints in the cellar. Martha prepared the special tea that would make their victim compliant, mixing herbs and powders with the expertise of someone who had performed this task countless times. Rebecca, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of her fate. She spent the afternoon reading by the fire, occasionally making polite conversation with the family members who came and went. Her intelligence and education were evident in every word she spoke, making the planned destruction of her mind and spirit all the more tragic. "She's a schoolteacher," Constance reported to her parents with obvious satisfaction. "Traveling to take a position in Minnesota. No one will miss her for weeks." As evening approached, Samuel found himself faced with an impossible choice. He could participate in Rebecca's destruction, proving his loyalty to the family and ensuring his own survival. Or he could try to warn her, knowing that such an action would likely result in his own death or worse. The weight of years of conditioning warred with the last vestiges of his conscience as he watched Rebecca accept the drugged tea from his mother's hands. Soon, she would be unconscious and helpless, ready to be carried down to the cellar where her real education would begin. Samuel closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. How could he ask for divine guidance when his family claimed to be doing God's work? How could he distinguish between right and wrong when he had been taught from birth that pain and submission were forms of worship? As Rebecca's eyelids began to droop and her speech became slurred, Samuel made his decision. He couldn't save her. The family's control was too complete, their methods too refined. But perhaps he could find a way to document their crimes, to leave some record that might eventually bring them to justice. It was a slim hope, but it was all he had left as the Moorfield family prepared to claim another victim in their endless quest for power and control, disguised as religious devotion. Rebecca's screams had been echoing through the cellar for 3 hours when Samuel finally reached his breaking point. Hidden in the shadows at the top of the stairs, he watched through the partially open door as his family systematically destroyed another innocent soul. The young schoolteacher's cries of anguish and betrayal cut through him like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the psychological conditioning that had kept him compliant for 21 years. Below, Ezekiel stood at his makeshift altar, his voice rising and falling in the rhythmic cadence of his perverted liturgy. "Through pain, we find truth," he intoned, while Jeremiah held Rebekah's struggling form against the crude wooden table. "Through submission, we discover the divine will." Martha circled the altar like a predator, her hands trailing over instruments of torture with the loving care of a mother tending to her children. "The flesh must be broken before the spirit can be reborn," she whispered, her pale eyes gleaming with fanatic fervor. "Only through complete surrender can we achieve true communion with the divine." Constance knelt beside the altar, her role in the ritual as disturbing as it was essential. She whispered words of false comfort to their victim, her voice honey-sweet as she explained how the pain was necessary, how the violation was sacred, how resistance would only make the suffering worse. It was a performance she had perfected over years of practice, a psychological manipulation that often proved more effective than physical force. The congregation watched in rapt attention, their faces reflecting the same mixture of religious ecstasy and carnal hunger that Samuel had learned to recognize and fear. These were his neighbors, people he had known his entire life, transformed into something monstrous by his family's twisted theology. The blacksmith's wife moaned in sympathetic pleasure as Rebekah's cries intensified. The schoolteacher rocked back and forth, his eyes rolled back in his head as if experiencing divine revelation. Even the elderly widow from the general store participated with an enthusiasm that belied her frail appearance. Samuel pressed his back against the wall, fighting the urge to vomit as he watched his family's latest atrocity unfold. He had witnessed dozens of these rituals over the years, but something about Rebekah's suffering had finally shattered the psychological barriers that had protected him from the full horror of his situation. Perhaps it was her intelligence, so evident in their brief conversations. Perhaps it was her youth and innocence, so similar to his own when the abuse had begun. Or perhaps it was simply that he had finally reached the limit of what his conscience could endure. As Rebekah's struggles weakened and her cries became whimpers, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't save her. It was already too late for that. But he could ensure that the truth about his family's crimes would eventually come to light. Moving as quietly as possible, he crept toward his father's study, where Ezekiel kept detailed records of their activities. The study was a monument to the patriarch's twisted scholarship, its walls lined with books on theology, psychology, and subjects that no Christian household should contain. Ancient texts bound in leather that looked suspiciously like human skin sat alongside modern treatises on the manipulation of human behavior. But it was the locked cabinet in the corner that held Samuel's interest, the place where his father kept his most precious possessions. Samuel had watched Ezekiel open the cabinet countless times over the years, memorizing the combination through careful observation. Inside, he found exactly what he had hoped for: detailed journals documenting every aspect of the family's activities. Names, dates, methods, and outcomes were all meticulously recorded in his father's precise handwriting. There were also photographs, images so disturbing that Samuel had to look away after the first glance. But most importantly, there were maps. Detailed drawings showing the locations of graves scattered across the family's property, marking the final resting places of those who had disappointed the congregation over the years. Samuel counted at least 30 marked locations, representing 3 decades of murder disguised as religious devotion. Working quickly, Samuel gathered the most damning evidence and stuffed it into a leather satchel. He knew he had only minutes before his absence would be noticed, and discovery would mean certain death. As he prepared to leave, his eyes fell on one final item: a letter addressed to the territorial governor, written in his father's hand, but never sent. The contents made his blood run cold. The letter outlined a plan to expand their operations, to establish similar congregations in other isolated communities throughout the Wisconsin territory. Ezekiel had been corresponding with like-minded individuals in other states, sharing techniques and recruiting new followers. The Moorfield family's crimes were not an isolated aberration. They were part of a larger network of predators using religious authority to justify their depravity. Samuel pocketed the letter and crept back toward the cellar stairs, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination. Below, Rebecca's ordeal was finally ending, her broken form being carried to join the other victims in the darkest corners of the underground chamber. The congregation was beginning to disperse, their unholy communion complete for another night. "Samuel!" His father's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Where have you been, boy?" I was praying, Father." Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Asking for strength to serve the Lord's will." Ezekiel studied his youngest son with suspicious eyes. "Your prayers will be answered soon enough. Tomorrow night, you will lead the final purification of our newest sister. It's time for you to prove your devotion once and for all." Samuel nodded, knowing that he had less than 24 hours to act. As the family retired to their rooms, he lay awake, planning his escape. He couldn't go to the local authorities. Too many of them were involved in his family's crimes. But the territorial capital was only a 3-day ride away, and there he might find officials who were beyond his father's influence. The next morning brought fresh snow and bitter cold, conditions that would make travel treacherous, but might also provide cover for his escape. Samuel went about his daily chores with mechanical precision, all the while watching for his opportunity. It came during the afternoon, when Jeremiah left to check on the livestock and his parents were occupied with preparations for the evening's ritual. Samuel saddled his horse and secured the satchel of evidence beneath his coat. As he prepared to leave, he took one last look at the farmhouse that had been his prison for 21 years. Somewhere inside, Rebecca lay broken and dying, another victim of his family's monstrous appetites. He whispered a prayer for her soul and for the souls of all those who had suffered within these walls. The ride to the territorial capital was a nightmare of cold, exhaustion, and constant fear of pursuit. Samuel pushed his horse to its limits, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Behind him, he knew his family would soon discover his absence and realize what he had done. They would come after him with all the resources at their disposal, and if they caught him, his death would be slow and agonizing. But as the lights of the capital finally came into view on the 3rd day, Samuel allowed himself a moment of hope. In his satchel, he carried the evidence that would finally bring justice to the victims of the Moorfield family's crimes. The truth would come to light at last, and the nightmare that had consumed his entire life would finally end. What he didn't know was that his family's influence extended far beyond the borders of their isolated community, and that the network of corruption he had uncovered was more extensive and powerful than he could possibly imagine. The battle for justice was just beginning, and Samuel would soon discover that escaping his family's physical presence was only the first step in a much longer and more dangerous journey. The territorial courthouse in Madison buzzed with an energy that Samuel had never experienced before. For 3 days, he had sat in the witness chair, his voice growing hoarse as he recounted the horrors he had witnessed at the Moorfield farm. The evidence he had brought, the journals, photographs, and maps, lay spread across the prosecutor's table like accusations written in blood and ink. Judge Harrison Blackwood, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, had presided over the proceedings with the gravity befitting such monstrous crimes. The courtroom was packed with reporters from newspapers as far away as Chicago and New York. all eager to document what was being called the most shocking case of religious extremism in American history. Mr. Moorfield, the prosecutor, District Attorney William Thornton, addressed Samuel with a mixture of sympathy and determination. You have testified that your family's activities began long before your birth. Can you tell the court what you discovered about the origins of these practices? Samuel's hands trembled as he opened one of his father's journals to a page he had marked. According to my father's writings, it began with my grandfather, Josiah Moorfield, in 1838. He claimed to have received visions that revealed the true nature of Christian worship. The early entries describe how he began experimenting with what he called sacred disciplines on his own family members. A collective gasp rose from the gallery as Samuel read excerpts from the journal, his voice barely above a whisper. The descriptions were so graphic and disturbing that several spectators left the courtroom, unable to bear hearing more. The practices evolved over time, Samuel continued, his eyes fixed on the pages before him to avoid seeing the horrified faces in the crowd. My grandfather recruited others, using a combination of religious authority and psychological manipulation. When my father inherited the farm in 1845, he expanded the operation significantly. District Attorney Thornton approached the witness stand, his expression grim. Samuel, I know this is difficult, but the court needs to understand the scope of these crimes. How many victims would you estimate your family claimed over the years? Samuel's voice broke as he answered. The maps show 37 burial sites on our property alone, but there were others. People who were broken but kept alive. People who were sold to other members of the network. People who simply disappeared. The revelation that the Moorfield family was part of a larger network had sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. Telegraphs had been sent to authorities in Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois, warning them to investigate similar religious communities in their jurisdictions. Judge Blackwood leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Mr. Moorfield, you have provided this court with evidence of crimes so heinous that they challenge our understanding of human depravity. But I must ask, why did you wait so long to come forward? Why didn't you seek help sooner? The question Samuel had been dreading finally came, and he struggled to find words that could convey the psychological prison his family had constructed around him. Your Honor, I was born into this nightmare. From my earliest memories, I was taught that what we did was God's will, that the pain and suffering were necessary for salvation. Those who questioned the family's methods were punished so severely that resistance seemed impossible. He paused, gathering strength to continue. It wasn't until I saw what they did to Rebecca Morrison, the school teacher, that I finally understood the truth. She was innocent, intelligent, full of life and hope. Watching them destroy her made me realize that nothing we did could possibly be justified by any interpretation of Christian faith. The mention of Rebecca's name brought a sob from the gallery, where her sister had been sitting throughout the trial. The young woman had traveled from Minnesota when news of Rebecca's fate reached her, and her presence served as a constant reminder of the human cost of the Moorfield family's crimes. As Samuel's testimony concluded, District Attorney Thornton presented the physical evidence that would seal the family's fate. The photographs were too disturbing to be shown publicly, but their existence was documented for the record. The journals provided a detailed chronicle of 3 decades of systematic abuse, torture, and murder. Most damning of all were the maps, which had already led investigators to the first of many unmarked graves scattered across the Moorfield property. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Thornton addressed the 12 men who would decide the family's fate. You have heard testimony and seen evidence of crimes that defy comprehension. The defendants used the sacred trust placed in religious leaders to prey upon the innocent and vulnerable. They perverted the very concept of Christian faith to justify acts of unspeakable cruelty. The defense attorney, a young man named Robert Caldwell, who had been appointed by the court, faced an impossible task. How could anyone defend the indefensible? His strategy focused on claims of religious freedom and mental incompetence, but the evidence against his clients was overwhelming. The prosecution would have you believe that my clients are monsters, Caldwell argued desperately, but they are simply misguided individuals who became lost in their interpretation of religious doctrine. They believed, however wrongly, that their actions served a higher purpose. Judge Blackwood's response was swift and decisive. Mr. Caldwell, this court will not entertain the notion that religious belief can justify torture, rape, and murder. The defendant's actions represent a fundamental violation of every principle upon which civilized society is built. The trial's conclusion came after only 2 hours of jury deliberation. Ezekiel, Martha, Jeremiah, and Constance Moorfield were found guilty on all counts: multiple charges of murder, kidnapping, torture, and conspiracy. The sentences were equally swift: death by hanging for all 4 defendants, to be carried out within 30 days. But even as justice was served in the courtroom, the investigation into the broader network continued. Samuel's evidence had revealed connections to similar groups in at least 6 other states, and federal marshals were already moving to investigate these leads. The Moorfield family's crimes were just the tip of an iceberg that threatened to expose a nationwide conspiracy of religious extremists using faith as a cover for their depravity. As the defendants were led away in chains, Ezekiel turned to look at his youngest son one final time. The patriarch's eyes held no remorse, no recognition of the suffering he had caused. Instead, they burned with the same fanatic fervor that had driven him for 30 years. "You have doomed yourself, boy," he called out, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "The Lord's work will continue, with or without us. There are others who understand the true path to salvation." Samuel met his father's gaze without flinching, drawing strength from the knowledge that he had finally broken free from the psychological chains that had bound him for so long. "Then they will face the same justice you're about to receive," he replied quietly. The executions took place on a cold February morning, exactly 1 month after the trial's conclusion. Samuel chose not to attend, instead spending the day at the small cemetery where Rebecca Morrison and the other identified victims had been laid to rest. He placed flowers on each grave, whispering prayers for forgiveness and peace. The Moorfield farm was burned to the ground by order of the territorial government, its ashes scattered to prevent it from becoming a shrine for those who might seek to continue the family's twisted legacy. The investigation into the broader network continued for months, ultimately leading to the arrest and conviction of dozens of conspirators across the Midwest. Samuel himself faced a difficult path forward. Though cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, he carried the psychological scars of his upbringing and the guilt of his years of silence. He eventually moved to California, where he worked as a teacher, and spent his remaining years helping other victims of religious abuse find their way back to healing and hope. The Moorfield case became a watershed moment in American law enforcement, leading to new protections for religious freedom while establishing clear boundaries for what could be justified in the name of faith. It served as a stark reminder that evil could hide behind any facade, even the most sacred, and that vigilance was the price of protecting the innocent from those who would exploit their trust. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the power of one person's courage to expose the truth, no matter how terrible that truth might be. Samuel Moorfield's decision to break his silence had not only brought justice to his family's victims, but had also prevented countless future atrocities by exposing and dismantling a network of predators that had operated in the shadows for decades. The nightmare was finally over, but its lessons would echo through history, serving as a warning to future generations about the dangers of blind faith and the importance of questioning authority, even when that authority claimed to speak for God himself.